There's a storm a-comin'. That deadly stillness right before a great battle. Lee's turned. He's on the attack. He's got infantry moving. The main body. In open country, and they're all concentrating this way. In the morning, he'll have skirmishers 3 deep. And 70,000 men right behind them. The whole damn Reb army. They'll move through town, occupy those hills, the high ground, and there'll be the devil to pay. I've led a soldier's life, and I've never seen anything as brutally clear as this. It's as if it's already done, already a memory. I can see the line of blue troops heading up the long slope to the stony top in one long, bloody moment. But maybe we can hold them. Deny Lee the high ground.
After 150 years, Gettysburg still has tremendous currency in American imaginations. And I think it's largely for 4 reasons. One is the sheer size of the battle. Physically speaking, it was spread over something like 20 square miles, which easily dwarfs, let's say, the Battle of Waterloo. It was larger in size and dimension than any other Civil War battle except the major sieges. And then there were the losses, the casualties for these 3 days at Gettysburg were simply staggering. We're talking in the vicinity of some 53,000 killed, wounded, missing, unaccounted for in some way, never seen again. These are losses, these are bloodlettings of a dimension which tended to stagger even European imaginations. In fact, there'd be nothing quite so drastic this way until the Marne, the Battle of the Somme, the First World War. I think also that another factor which enters into the way that Gettysburg still exercises fascination for us is the might have been. What if Gettysburg had turned out differently? If Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had been victorious, well, the Army of the Potomac would very likely have gone to pieces. Lee could have been perfectly at ease crossing the Susquehanna to threaten Philadelphia, or perhaps curling to the south to threaten Baltimore and Washington. At the same time as Lee is marching toward Gettysburg, President Davis of the Confederacy has commissioned his vice president, Alexander Stephens, to pay a visit to Washington, D.C. Literally, he's going on a truce boat down the James River to Fortress Monroe, and from there, the idea is that Stephens will be going to Washington, up the Chesapeake Bay, up the Potomac. Ostensibly, they're going to be talking about prisoner exchanges. However, Davis has made it clear that if there are favorable military signs in Pennsylvania, these discussions may in fact turn into peace negotiations between Alexander Stephens and Abraham Lincoln. And when you think about the fact that less than 2 weeks after Gettysburg, New York City erupts in draft riots, it's entirely possible that a Confederate victory at Gettysburg might indeed have triggered even larger riots in many other places. And picture this, if you can, the Army of the Potomac being nowhere near New York to put down the riots, but in fact, and instead, the Army of Northern Virginia restoring civil order to New York City. All of that is part of the might have been that Gettysburg poses to us. But I think ultimately the thing which puts the halo around Gettysburg is Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. Because by coming to Gettysburg for what would otherwise have simply been the dedication of a cemetery at Gettysburg, through those brief comments that he makes, he creates an entire universe of meaning for the Battle of Gettysburg. And that universe of meaning has been with us for 150 years, and probably will be for a good long time after that as well. And that address which he never actually calls the Gettysburg Address. But those words, I think, give to Gettysburg the kind of sacred glow that means that Gettysburg is always one of those places in American history which remains instantly identifiable. As much as Americans may forget, as much as our history teaching may fall very short of giving to people and to the American people as a whole a sense of their past, nevertheless, one of the things that certainly every American recognizes, maybe not in all the details they should, but still we recognize instantly what someone is talking about when they talk about Gettysburg. Although John Buford really did perform amazingly well on the morning of July 1st, the whole strategy of using dismounted cavalry to hold off and delay a Confederate occupation of Gettysburg, that was a great deed, but it wasn't the only deed. And there are a long list of people who do remarkable things that first day, improvising ways of trying to prevent the Army of Northern Virginia from seizing not only Gettysburg, but the really important piece of real estate, which was Cemetery Hill, just on the south edge of the town. Certainly the most important that way was Oliver Otis Howard, the commander of the 11th Corps, because it is Oliver Otis Howard who secures Cemetery Hill with one of his divisions and who spends all of July 1st making sure that Cemetery Hill is going to be not just a fallback position, but in fact is going to be held by the Union Army. Because if the Army of the Potomac can hold Cemetery Hill, it can hold everything else. Take away Cemetery Hill, abandon Cemetery Hill, and there's almost no good position in south central Pennsylvania for the Army of the Potomac to confront the Confederate Army. So Otis Howard's decision, hold Cemetery Hill, is itself a key decision, maybe the single most important decision made during the course of the battle. I think the real question is whether Lee had a strategy at all. In fact, Lee wasn't even on the battlefield until around 2 o'clock on the afternoon of July 1st. And when he does arrive, his first impulse is to break off the action. This is not what he had intended. What he had originally had in view was to concentrate all three of his big infantry corps between Gettysburg and Cashtown. But on July 1st, A.P. Hill had inopportunely committed his corps to an entanglement with Federal troops that he found at Gettysburg. Lee has no idea that an action is taking place until he hears the cannon fire from 8 miles away at Cashtown. And then he has to come forward at Gettysburg and sort out what is happening. And the first conclusion he comes to is, this is not what I've planned. My army is not concentrated. This is not a battle I want to fight here. But his army is in fact doing so well. The Confederate troops that are at Gettysburg are gaining so much ground that after a while he changes his mind. Maybe this is the way he wants to fight. And so he begins directing and coordinating the troops of Richard Ewell's corps and of Powell Hill's corps. They both then, at that point in the afternoon of July 1st, close in like two jaws on a trap and wreck the Federal 11th and 1st Corps and send them fleeing back through the town. But Lee doesn't really have a strategy worked out for that situation. His assumption had been that he would have July 1st, perhaps even July 2nd, available to concentrate all three of his corps around Gettysburg and then deal with the isolated units of the Army of the Potomac as they unwarily moved north in pursuit of him. Abner Doubleday does a very good job, and a surprisingly good job, as a temporary corps commander in holding off the onslaught of Lee's army as they are marching in from Cashtown on the road to Gettysburg. Deploys his men well, holds that ground for over 6 hours, and finally makes a last stand at the Lutheran Seminary on Seminary Ridge, in which he himself takes personal part. He actually is assisting cannoneers in the artillery batteries to sight their guns. He takes his own headquarters guard and deploys them in line, and they make this remarkable last stand on Seminary Ridge, which is the final factor, really, in holding off the Confederate onslaught in the direction of Gettysburg. In addition to Abner Doubleday, Doubleday's colleague, so to speak, as a division commander in the First Corps, James Wadsworth, who's not a professional soldier, never been to West Point. Nevertheless, Wadsworth, whom his troops affectionately called Old Waddy, does a remarkable job in not only getting his men into action, but in fact managing them during the battle, even though they are severely outnumbered. Other division commanders who shine that way include Henry Baxter. We don't often think of Henry Baxter as a great hero of Gettysburg, but Henry Baxter was one very pugnacious, even though non-professional soldier. And Baxter's stand at the extension of Oak Ridge, repelling the first attempt by Ewell's Corps to take in flank the Federal positions on Seminary Ridge, that's simply an extraordinary performance. And he does it with gusto. So point after point after point on July 1st, it's not only Buford, but it's division commanders, it's brigade commanders, right down the ladder of command, who do extremely well and perform these wonderful self-initiated deeds, holding that ground, trying to stave off a complete collapse, trying to prevent, and successfully preventing, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia from just rolling into Gettysburg, rolling up to Cemetery Hill, and occupying what would otherwise have been an extremely difficult position for the Army of the Potomac to have evicted them from. George Meade earns the laurel of being the victor of Gettysburg, the hero of Gettysburg. And he was. He was the victorious general there. And he made good decisions, he did the right things. But is he really an American equivalent of the Duke of Wellington, or even of Ike Eisenhower or George Patton? No, because Meade did not really have a strategy for Gettysburg. Meade, in fact, never really intended to fight at Gettysburg. Meade had only been in command of the Army of the Potomac for 3 days when the Battle of Gettysburg takes place. So at least in the most basic sense, he never really had much of an opportunity to develop a strategy. But even beyond that, George Meade was almost everybody's last choice for commander of the Army of the Potomac. Almost every other corps commander in the Army of the Potomac had been previously approached about succeeding Fighting Joe Hooker in command of the Army, Hancock, Reynolds. But every one of them had turned it down. Turned it down because of the political problems. When it comes to George Meade, Abraham Lincoln does not offer command of the Army of the Potomac to Meade. He orders him to take command of it. It wasn't a request like the others. It was, I've run out of generals. You're the only one left. Congratulations, you're now in command of the Army of the Potomac. Nobody was more surprised at that than George Meade himself. When the messenger from the War Department showed up to hand him his orders, Meade's first conclusion was that he was being put under arrest. So Meade does not expect to be commander of the Army of the Potomac. He doesn't really have a lot in the way of time to develop a plan. And the plan that he does develop doesn't have anything to do with Gettysburg. Meade's plan is to fight a defensive battle behind Pipe Creek in western Maryland. Pipe Creek is a tributary of the Monocacy River, which in turn flows into the Potomac. And it offered a good position if what you wanted to do, or what you thought your mission was purely protective. Protect Baltimore, protect Washington. And that was Meade's concept of strategy. Defend the Pipe Creek line. Of course, what that meant was that Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia might be given free rein to romp through Pennsylvania. But for Meade, that was not the most important consideration. The most important consideration was defend Washington, defend Baltimore. Partly that was because it's what he'd been told. Lincoln, Stanton had made it very clear. The principal mission of the Army of the Potomac was to protect the Capitol. But it also tended to run with Meade's own temperament. Meade was a very cautious person. He had, in his own life experience, seen how easy it was for reputations and fortunes to be thrown away by incautious decisions. Principal example being his own father, who had originally been involved in government finance in Europe, went bankrupt. Just about ruined the family. That was why George Meade went to West Point, because the family could no longer afford a college education, and they sent him to the one place where he could get it for free. Meade understood that in war, things can be very, very, very chancy. And he was determined not to take the kinds of chances that he'd seen ruin so many other people. Also, Meade is a Democrat. He is a McClellanite. And he is convinced that if he makes all the right decisions, fights all the right battles, and does all the right things, he's still not going to get any credit for it from Lincoln or Stanton or from the radicals in Congress. Whereas if he loses, if he makes wrong decisions, they will crucify him. So his solution is to say, if that's the kind of war they want to fight, then that's the kind of war I'll fight. Very cautious, very defensive, taking no chances. And if they're disappointed afterwards that I have not been more aggressive, well, that serves them right, because that's the kind of war climate, that's the kind of strategic environment that Lincoln and the radicals have created. So there.
Both Gettysburg and Gods and Generals have a very strong life in home video and in all the aftermarkets, broadcast television. They have found an audience and that continues to renew itself. And witnessed by a year and a half, 2 years ago, Warner Brothers released the director's cuts of both movies. There actually was a longer version than the Gettysburg movie. It was almost 18 minutes longer, which even I had forgotten. So when they said, you know, we have a longer version we want to release as a director's cut, I said, there is no longer version. And then I was corrected when they showed me that, in fact, there was one that I'd forgotten about. And that was refinished almost 2 years ago, remixed and recolored and released along with Gods and Generals. In the case of Gods and Generals, there was, in fact, an hour more of material we added, re-edited the whole film and restored that to its original. And those films just play in the home video market. So it's been very gratifying that the audience keeps discovering and rediscovers those movies. It's rare that if I go to a public event that somebody doesn't come in and comment on either Gettysburg or Gods and Generals. And it's, you know, deeply appreciated. You know, if a person come up to me and make a comment on one of those movies, it's meaningful to me that both those films live, in the case of Gettysburg, now for 20 years. You know, you never know how a film's going to be received when you make it, and you never know how it's going to be received with the passage of time. I think all any of us filmmakers do is try to do our best work, or honest work, and you know, see what happens. I think certainly in the case of Gettysburg, we started with an extraordinary novel, Michael Sharra's The Killer Angels. Great storytelling, great characters. Another thing we had going for us was Ted Turner, because very few filmmakers had the liberty that I had to tell that story in both the time, that's a 4 hour and 15-minute film, and the artistic freedom. I mean, Ted Turner gave me complete artistic freedom. Didn't have to. I didn't have a final cut in my contract, but he did, in effect. And that allowed a great deal of freedom without the constraints of trying to squeeze it into a certain time. We had budgetary constraints, but don't we all? And so it just all came together in terms of the studio, which was Ted Turner, the right kind of atmosphere created where this filmmaker could do his best work. And then we had a great cast, just a wonderful collection of actors, wonderful crew, and it was a magical time. I mean, we worked our butts off the summer of 1992 at Gettysburg when we filmed that. long hours. We had way too many setups that we could possibly have done per day, but we did it. We got the job done. And we remain to this day a band of brothers and sisters, those of us who worked on that movie.
July 1st is a great day for heroism, but July 2nd outdoes it, even in more dramatic ways. You start with the most famous example, which is the defense of Little Round Top. No one had really given very much thought to Little Round Top, especially on the federal side, which is surprising given the fact that it's a very prominent hill along with its big sister, Big Round Top. But that simply hadn't been what George Meade expected. He had not thought there was going to be fighting at that far end of the battlefield. And so between himself and other federal commanders, the terrain wasn't even covered. It wasn't until they were in the midst of the fighting itself, when it looked like Confederate troops were going to overrun the hill, that suddenly someone wakes up and says, we have a problem. That someone was Gouverneur K. Warren, who was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac. Warren took it on his own authority to call units from the 5th Corps out of their line of march and up to the defense of Little Round Top. One unit is Strong Vincent's brigade. They're the first Union troops to get up on Little Round Top. And Strong Vincent himself is another one of these people who does the right thing at the right moment, because Strong Vincent deploys his 4 regiments around the south end of Little Round Top, does it just in time. 15 minutes after his 4 regiments are in place, the Confederates, in this case Alabamians and Texans, show up in force. And Strong Vincent's brigade holds on until it's almost breaking. Vincent himself goes down with a bullet to the groin, which is going to kill him. And then, just as it looks like Vincent's brigade is going to be overwhelmed, another brigade that Warren had called up to Little Round Top appears, and this is Stephen Weed's brigade. They're led by Patty O'Rourke, who's the colonel of the 140th New York. They came up at right the split second when the far right flank regiment of Vincent's brigade was crumbling and beginning to fall back to the rear. And O'Rourke's people don't even stop to load. They just come right on, smack right into the Texas regiments that are coming up the west face of Little Round Top and stun them, throw them back. All of this is last minute. All of this is throwing the whole chain of command right to the winds. It's people taking their own initiative and making their own decisions. And that's only at one end of the battlefield. In the middle of the battlefield, at about 6:30, 7 o'clock that evening, as the Confederate Army is punching hole after hole after hole through the Union line along the Emmitsburg Road, Winfield Scott Hancock, Major General, Commander of the 2nd Corps, turns around and sees the entirety of Cadmus Wilcox's Confederate brigade coming across the road. Hancock turns, looks for reinforcements to plug up the gaps, and only sees one regiment. And that is Colville's 1st Minnesota. And he says, you need to move right into that gap. Do you see those flags pointing to the Confederate colors? Take those flags. Colville's got 1 regiment. He's got 262 men. He doesn't even balk. Lines his men up, takes them forward at a trot. Here is one understrength Federal regiment taking on an entire big Confederate brigade. The odds are at least 8-1 in the Confederate favor. But Colville and the 1st Minnesota smack right into the Confederates, take them by surprise, stun them, and then the Confederates begin to fall back because they're assuming that, well, it wouldn't be 1 regiment attacking us. These guys must be the leading edge. They must be the spear point of something bigger. So the Confederates fall back. Well, the 1st Minnesota falls back too, and there's not too much left of the 1st Minnesota by the time they break off the action. But they've saved the day there. And then at the other end of the battlefield, up at Cemetery Hill, East Cemetery Hill is attacked by 2 brigades from Jubal Early's division of Richard Ewell's Corps. And these Confederates roll right over Federal troops posted at the base of East Cemetery Hill. They roll up the hill. They overrun the Federal batteries on East Cemetery Hill, and it looks like game over. And right at that moment comes pelting from the other side of Cemetery Hill Samuel Sprigg Carroll and his 3 regiments. They hit the Confederates on East Cemetery Hill entirely by surprise. And these brigades from Early's division are forced back down the hill. The day is saved again. But oh, wait, because there's one more, and that is over on Culp's Hill. At the same time as the Federal Army is pulling units away from various places to plug up gaps in the other parts of the line, George Meade pulls almost the entirety of the 12th Corps off Culp's Hill to buck up places that are yielding at other parts of the line. The one brigade which is left to hold Culp's Hill is under George Sears Green, who is the oldest general officer in the Federal Army. Old Pappy Green, as they called him, has only one brigade, and what he doesn't realize is that there is an entire Confederate division in position ready to attack Culp's Hill, which they do. But Green has taken precautions. Green was one very shrewd little gnome of an officer, and he had dug his men in, and when those Confederates, an entire division worth, come up Culp's Hill trying to seize the hill, Green's little brigade shoots them to pieces. And all because old Pappy had thought a couple of jumps ahead about what to do about holding Culp's Hill. So from one end of the battlefield to the other, from Pappy Green on Culp's Hill all the way down to Strong Vincent and Paddy O'Rourke at Little Round Top, you have one Federal officer, one Federal unit after another on their own hook, their own decisions, their own initiative, doing the most remarkable things that any military officer could possibly do in the middle of an American battle.
There are so many stories about Gettysburg that fascinate people and capture their imagination, but from my perspective, being from Maine, the story of the 20th Maine on Little Round Top is really remarkable. This is a regiment that had almost no battle experience at all. This was, as they described it, their first stand-up fight. They were commanded by a colonel who had received his promotion the day before the battle started, so he was the newest colonel in the Army. He had been away from the unit for 10 days because he was so sick of malarial fever and other things that he was unable to even keep up with the regiment. And yet, quite by accident, or the happenstance of battle, they ended up being in this very key position on the second day. And this regiment that had no real great expectation of being highly successful because they were inexperienced and their colonel was not in the best of shape that he could be, still managed to very successfully hold their position and prevent themselves from being overrun. And that has created the story of the famous story of the 20th Maine since. But what most people don't realize about the 20th Maine is their great inexperience, their colonel's inexperience. He had never commanded the regiment in battle before. They had never been in what they called a stand-up fight before. Chamberlain and many of the other men were very sick with malaria and dysentery, all of which makes it very hard to fight a battle or to lead men with confidence and make them perceive you as being in command and control. So it was a difficult thing for them, and all of the stories of the men fighting 500 miles away from home in this strange place make it a real sort of compelling story. But all across the battlefield, you have these stories of men from all different walks of life, from illiterate men to college professors, from rich people to poor people, fighting on both sides, and having this tremendous experience in their lives. And then reading as they spent the rest of their lives trying to figure out what that meant and why it was important. I think the main reason that Joshua Chamberlain's story outshines a lot of others, first of all, is that he survived. One of the things that is important in telling your story sometimes is to be around to tell it. And a lot of the other officers on Little Round Top, the commanding officers, were killed. And that's sort of the beginning. But I think from the time the battle happened, so little it was expected of him, being a minister and a college professor, not a West Point grad, and having no real military experience. The fact that he and his regiment performed as well as they did was quite surprising to the other people in the brigade and in the Army. And so that began this story of Chamberlain as this unlikely hero. And then he was around after the battle and after the war to write about it, to speak publicly about it, and for others to talk about what happened there. And I think that helps. When you die during the course of the battle, obviously you're not around to advocate for your point of view or to even tell your story. And that, I think, has a lot to do with it. The other is, I think a lot of people like his story because he was kind of, in many ways, sort of everyman. He was not an experienced military person. He was not physically really up to the task because of the illnesses that he was struggling with. No experience at this kind of thing. And yet there he was, not only succeeding, or not only getting by or coping through the battle, but succeeding in carrying out the mission he was given. And I think a lot of people sort of like the idea of this guy totally unprepared and totally in not the right condition or frame of mind or physical to succeed so well. While people know that after the war, Chamberlain was governor of Maine for 4 terms and president of Bowdoin College, and from there people say, and lived happily ever after. When in fact his post-war career was really quite miserable. The wound that he sustained at Petersburg troubled him for the rest of his life. He had a number of surgeries, constant infections, and just he was physically very miserable for the rest of his life. Unlike other veterans who had a leg missing or an arm missing, you couldn't see the wound, but it was something that caused him a great deal of pain and difficulty the rest of his life. And his last 50 years were really quite unhappy. His brother drank himself to death. His wife went blind and eventually passed away. And there isn't a lot from his post-war career that he could look back on with a great deal of satisfaction or success. His business ventures didn't pan out. His political popularity in the leaders of his party was not very great. And so there's not a lot really to look at in the last 50 years of his life that gave him a great deal of joy. Probably the most exciting and thrilling and important thing that he looked back on in his post-war years was in 1880, there was some dispute over who was elected governor. And the outgoing governor decided to leave the state. Chamberlain was the head of the state militia, so he put him in charge. And Chamberlain basically had to hold mobs at bay until the Supreme Court could be seated and decide who had won the governorship. Both sides offered him a seat in the U.S. Senate if he would choose their candidate. And at some point in time, his life was threatened, and there were mobs, trying to find him. He had to move every couple of hours from house to house at night so as not to be found. And finally, he got fed up with the whole process and presented himself in the state capitol rotunda, turned and faced the mob, and essentially said, "Look, if you want to kill me, go ahead. I've been offered myself to be killed a number of times before, and you don't scare me any more than that did. And if you want to kill me, go ahead." And there was some quiet and murmuring in the mob, and eventually it sort of turned and dissipated because he had shown this again in his life, this personal courage. And people understood the kind of person he was, and then he had in fact offered himself to be killed, and darn near was a number of times in the war. And it greatly diffused the whole crisis and caused both parties to say, okay, we'll wait for the Supreme Court, which eventually was seated and did make a decision. As he described it to his wife, yesterday was another round top, he said. And the accolades poured in. He received dozens and dozens of letters from people all over the country congratulating him for not giving in to one political side or the other. And in the other less happy parts of his life in those last decades, that was the one moment where something really important and triumphant happened. And there were a lot of people who called for his nomination to be a U.S. Senator because he was he had presented such a concept of valor and fairness and law-abiding way of doing things, and people thought he should be a senator. He never was nominated, unfortunately, but it really was a high point in his post-war career for him.
For all that has been written about the Battle of Gettysburg, and there has been a tremendous amount written, there's still surprisingly large amounts of material. There's large numbers of stories which have never yet been told, and which it has been both fun and an education in its own right to uncover. I think, for instance, of an individual like Francis Heath. Francis Heath was the lieutenant colonel of the 19th Maine, not a professional soldier. He, in fact, had come fresh out of Colby College and out of his father's law office, where he was reading law, to become an officer in the 19th Maine. He is in effective charge of the regiment at Gettysburg, and on July 2nd, as the Federal line is breaking to pieces, and the Confederate tide looks like it's about to roll over everyone. Heath is in command of his main regiment as one of those posted to try to hold off the retreat of the battered Third Corps. In the midst of the smoke and the confusion, the confused retreat of clumps and units of Third Corps troops, one of the division commanders of the Third Corps appears out of the battle murk, and that is Andrew Atkinson Humphreys. Humphreys' division has been chewed to pieces, and Humphreys is beside himself. He has had a very long and a very difficult day, and there's a way in which Humphreys has simply at this point lost it. Humphreys comes up to the 19th Maine, tells the men to fix their bayonets and to use them on any of the fleeing soldiers of his own division. And Francis Heath hears this and can't believe it. He didn't volunteer to fight in this war to kill his own people. And as Humphreys is raving out of control up and down the front of the 19th Maine, Heath decides he's not going to let this stand. He follows Humphreys. Humphreys is going down the line of the 19th Maine. Fix these bayonets. Use them on those men. And Heath is following behind this major general and saying, don't pay any attention to him. Don't listen to him. Don't do it. Don't do it. He says, look, we'll rally your men on our own, but we're not going to kill them the way you want to. And Humphreys, finally facing Heath's refusal to cooperate, just wanders off, and he has his own conscience he's going to have to face. But I thought, what a remarkable moment, that even in the midst of that stress and that battle, here is someone who has not lost his sense of decency and balance and is willing to do something about it, even if it means telling off a major general. There are other great moments about politics, for instance. Both of these armies are deeply riven by politics. In the case of the Army of Northern Virginia, it's, are you really a true, loyal secessionist? There were large parts of the Army of Northern Virginia which were under suspicion. Virginians ran the Army of Northern Virginia. They held in suspicion people from North Carolina and Georgia, who, it was pretty largely suspected, were not quite as enthusiastic about secession as troops from other Confederate states. That sets up a tension. And that tension between North Carolinians and Georgians who resent being put under suspicion, and Virginians who seem like they feel they've been divinely commanded to take charge of everything in the Army of Northern Virginia. That sets up some interesting confrontations, also helps to explain some lack of coordination in the Army of Northern Virginia. But the Army of the Potomac has it even worse. The political divisions in the Army of the Potomac were so serious that they even affect military decisions and personnel decisions. When George Meade arrives at Gettysburg on the evening between July 1st and July 2nd, one of the first things he does is to pull Abner Doubleday off command of the First Corps. Doubleday had succeeded John Reynolds after Reynolds was killed the morning of July 1st. Meade replaces him with John Newton from the Sixth Corps. Why? Because Doubleday is probably the most outspoken abolitionist Republican in the Army of the Potomac, and John Newton is a loyal, if colorless, McClellanite. That's a personnel decision made on the basis of politics. And when Meade posts Dan Sickles and his Third Corps way off on the left flank of the Army, a large part of that decision is a political one, because Sickles, although Sickles is a Democrat, he's a war Democrat. He's pro-Lincoln. And there's very little love lost between Dan Sickles and George Meade. Meade posts him out of the way, where he won't be much of a bother or, in fact, much a part of the battle. Of course, what Meade did not realize was that in posting Sickles where he did, he was really putting Sickles right under the steamroller that was going to come down on them on July 2nd. But again, it's a decision which is made largely by politics. So politics plays a surprising role in the decisions made by both armies during this battle.
Well, here you have this 23-year-old former a first lieutenant. He's only been a brigadier general since June 28th. And on July 3rd, he ignores orders from his corps commander to report to the left flank of the Union Army because he can see thousands of Confederate cavalry who are converging on the Union right. There's only an understrength division there under David Gregg, and with General Gregg's connivance, Custer's going to stay and help him hold back those Confederate troopers. In the fight at East Cavalry Battlefield, Custer and his brigade are going to hold the center of the Union line there. They're going to bear the brunt of the fighting. So whatever Jeb Stuart planned to do, and it looked like he was trying to get, as he reported, into the enemy rear at the same time that Pickett was attacking the center, Custer deserves a lot of the credit. He's not used to managing a brigade, but he exercises a personal brand of leadership that quickly wins the hearts of his Michigan troopers. When he sends the 7th Michigan Cavalry forward, he leads them himself. And in the climactic final charge, when there are 1,500 or more Confederate troopers coming down to try to pierce the Union center there, Custer will place himself in front of only 500 men from his 1st Michigan Cavalry. They're the only reserve the Union has. He will lead them forward in a charge. He will spur his horse at the last moment so every man behind him can see him, and then he raises his saber and yells, "Come on, you Wolverines!" and disappears among the rebels. His men, their blood goes up. In that instant, they give this tremendous shout and pour in after him, staggering the Confederate attack, holding it long enough so that other Union units can remount and hit the Confederates on their flanks and break that charge.
At the height of the great attack on July 3rd, we focus a great deal on George Pickett's division. We often forget who was standing on the other side of that wall, and that was the Philadelphia Brigade. 4 regiments, all raised from Philadelphia. They were the 69th, 71st, 72nd, and 106th Pennsylvania. They held that wall, they held the copse of trees, they held that little acre of ground. And though we don't often think about them, we think more about Pickett and Lewis Armistead. Nevertheless, it was the stubborn fighting of those Philadelphians which played a major role in stopping Pickett's charge dead. And then a little further to the north of that position, there is the part of the charge which didn't have anything to do with Pickett. Pickett's division, of course, was not the only division involved in Pickett's charge. There was also a division under Johnston Pettigrew, temporarily under Pettigrew's command, because its regular division commander had been wounded the day before. But Pettigrew's division comes up just as far, maybe even a little further, than Pickett's division manages to reach. And they come up and they surge around the farmhouse belonging to Abraham Bryan, one lieutenant in Pettigrew's division, with the odd name of Iowa Michigan Royster. He walks right up to the Federal line singing Dixie, only to be cut down by Federal bullets. Gettysburg is often described as being the high water mark of the Confederacy. And you can see that there's some reason for that, because this Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania never gets any further than Gettysburg. Although it is hard to get this entirely in focus because, in fact, Confederate units had penetrated substantially farther to the north. Richard Ewell's corps, for instance, had gone all the way up to Carlisle and even lobbed a few shells across the Susquehanna River at Harrisburg. Jubal Early's division had gotten all the way to York and to Wrightsville, and might in fact have gotten across the Susquehanna on the Great Wrightsville Railroad Bridge had not Federal troops, in this case mostly militia, managed to destroy the bridge before he could use it. So if we really want to mark a literal high point of the Confederate invasion, it really belongs somewhere in the neighborhood of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, rather than Gettysburg. And there are other moments when Confederates get loose on Northern territory. John Morgan is going to stage a major raid into Ohio in 1863. And in 1864, there's even a Confederate raid on St. Albans, Vermont. All right, yes, they launch it from Canada, so maybe that's not fair. But if you really want a high water mark, I suppose St. Albans, Vermont will do. But if we put this in terms of metaphor, then it begins to have more meaning. Because Gettysburg is a serious setback to the Confederacy, and for a number of reasons. One is the stupendous casualties the Army of Northern Virginia absorbs in this battle. The Army never comes back up to the strength that it had as it marched into Pennsylvania. Never actually recovers in terms of numbers. It will sustain serious damage to its morale, but the morale, in fact, will recover before the end of 1863. It's the numbers that are going to prove increasingly difficult to reconstitute an army with. There's also the damage done to Lee's reputation. And I don't mean some kind of invincibility that now federal commanders believe they really can defeat Robert E. Lee. Actually, the real damage done to Lee's reputation is done in the Confederacy. Lee had put so much of his emphasis on being allowed to take the Army of Northern Virginia into an invasion of the North. His argument had been that the way to win the war, the way to take pressure off the Union seizure of the Mississippi River Valley, the way to spare Vicksburg was to invade the North. Fight a battle on the Susquehanna, fight a battle on Northern soil. That's going to turn Northern opinion so much in the direction of peace that Northerners will demand that the Lincoln government negotiate. All of those arguments fell flat after Gettysburg. And never again is the Confederacy going to look to an invasion of the North as a way of winning the war. That weapon has not only been blunted, that's been put into storage. And the arguments that Lee had made all along for more than a year in favor of such a strategy are never going to be brought out again. I mean, Lee himself will talk about his desire to go back and invade the North again, but he's never actually going to be able to do it. So in that respect, as a strategy of carrying the war into the North, Gettysburg really is a high watermark. Also, when you reflect on the fact that in 1864 and 1865, the Confederacy shrinks in terms of the territory it controls, that it never manages to stage a reconquest of territory, that also makes the Confederacy look, if not like a receding tide from a high water mark, then certainly like a pond which is gradually evaporating. So again, yes, a high water mark. And I think it's also a high water mark in at least one sense for the Union Army. Understand that up till this point, the Army of the Potomac had been a collection of losers. They had lost battle after battle after battle. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, even the one quasi-victory they had won at Antietam in the fall of 1862 was still only a quasi-victory, and everybody knew it. It did not end in the destruction of Lee's army. But Gettysburg is different. There, it was a clear-cut, no qualifications, no footnotes answer to the question, can the Army of the Potomac win a battle? Now it was definite. It was clear. One soldier in the Army of the Potomac writes home, now what do you think of your Army of the Potomac? That is a high water mark. Lincoln's first reaction to the news of Gettysburg was, good, now let's finish the job. And there was every reason to expect that the job could be finished. It was not only Lincoln who was talking about finishing the job. Ordinary soldiers in the Army of the Potomac could see the devastation and havoc that had been wrought in the Confederate Army by Gettysburg. And even the men in the ranks, who were not always the ones to first jump up and down and say, yes, let's have a battle, now they were saying, let's get this war over with. Let's close in for the kill. Let's finish off the Army of Northern Virginia. We have them where we want them to be. It was made even more acute by the fact that after the Battle of Gettysburg, down came the rains, the Potomac River flooded. That meant that as Lee retreated, he backed up against his crossings at Williamsport, Maryland, and had nowhere to go. He could not get across the river. So with a badly battered, sadly depleted army, with victory inspiring the Army of the Potomac, with the Federals being able to call in reinforcements, especially Northern militia. All right, maybe not terribly reliable, but at least they could do a lot of the pickup jobs for veterans that would put Army of the Potomac veterans on the battle line. All of that made it seem abundantly clear that the golden opportunity to complete the war was right at hand. And Meade did not do it. Meade's pursuit of Lee is jerking and unresponsive. And even when he finally catches up to Lee at Williamsport, his behavior is circumspect, cautious. And even when he's about finally worked up to the point when he's going to give the order to attack and finds that the Army of the Potomac is looking at empty trenches because the Army of Northern Virginia has finally managed to cross the river in the night, Meade has to send that message to Lincoln, and Lincoln is devastated. Lincoln had already been getting anxious about the slowness of Meade's pursuit. He knew that Meade politically was coming from a very different angle than himself. And he was anxious that the history of the Army of the Potomac under generals like McClellan, and Meade, remember, was a friend of McClellan's, had never been terribly overeager. Putting all that together, Lincoln had gotten much more anxious as time went by. And when Meade finally cornered Lee at Williamsport, Lincoln even went to the point of sending a personal ambassador to Meade. In this case, his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, and the chair of the Senate Military Affairs Committee, Senator Henry Wilson. And the message that he sent with Hamlin to Meade was this: attack. If you are successful, you get all the credit. If the attack is a failure, I will take all the blame. But attack. And Meade doesn't do it. And when Meade sends word to Lincoln that Lee, in fact, has escaped across the Potomac, well, Robert Todd Lincoln told this best of all. Robert Todd Lincoln was home from Harvard. And on the morning when Lincoln got the message about Lee's escape, Robert went into his father's office, and there he found his father head down on his desk, weeping in frustration and despair. And Abraham Lincoln said to his eldest son, "We had them in the palm of our hands. We had only to close our fingers, and they were ours. And the war would be over." In anger, he turns to his Secretary of the Navy and he says, "There is bad faith somewhere. There is bad faith. What does it mean, Mr. Wells? Great God, what does it mean? Is this McClellan all over again? McClellan deliberately dragging his heels for political reasons? McClellan trying to offer Lee a safe conduct back across the river so that they can continue to talk about the possibility of a negotiated peace?" Lincoln writes a letter to Meade full of fury and disappointment. And then he reflects upon the fact that at least Meade won a victory, that if he pursues Meade, no one in the North is going to understand it. Why would the president find so much fault with the victor of Gettysburg? With all that in mind, Lincoln folds up the letter, never sends it, scrawls on it, "Never sent or signed." Meade, of course, finds out about this. He hears this through channels, and especially through the General-in-Chief of the Army, Henry Halleck. Meade immediately flies up in rage, offers his resignation. And Lincoln, instead now of prodding Meade to more deliberate action, Lincoln has to write a letter calming him down, almost apologizing. What a state of affairs. But Lincoln would continue to say afterwards for months, we had them in the palm of our hands. We could have ended the war right there at Williamsport, back up against the Potomac. But it didn't happen. And the war would go on for almost another 2 years. And there would be death and destruction and maiming. There would be heartbreak. There would be loss. And all that would go on. And Lincoln would always remember, this did not have to be. And the figure that he would always come back to pin it upon was George Gordon Meade.
Veterans of the Army of the Potomac would return to Gettysburg for years after the battle, partially because they were enormously proud of what happened there. They felt they had done their best fighting of the war there. Also, it was convenient. It was in the North. And it was a more hospitable place to relive the war than if he went down south, and you'd be surrounded by people who would resent you celebrating a victory over Robert E. Lee, say, on Virginia soil. But the Army of the Potomac was determined to make Gettysburg its monument. And that's one reason why all those pieces of stone and bronze litter that battlefield. That's where they chose to have their war remembered. You're going to have 3 big blue and gray reunions at Gettysburg. The first 25 years after the fact in 1888. The 50th anniversary in 1913, though, was a really big deal. About 54,000 veterans attended, 8,000 Confederate, and the rest Union. And that was the biggest gathering of Civil War soldiers, I think, since the war ended. These men just came together not only to renew ties with old comrades, but also it became a great symbol of national reconciliation. Men who had fought each other like tigers on both sides are now acting as brothers. And that symbolism meant a lot to America 50 years after the Civil War, as the world teetered on the brink of a war that would dwarf what happened here, the First World War. The last big blue and gray reunion was in 1938, the 75th. By that time, the number of veterans had been drastically thin. There were about 8,000 living Civil War veterans, but 2,000 or so of those frail old men made it to Gettysburg. They had to have a large corps of doctors and nurses there to monitor their health. Many of them needed Boy Scouts to help them move around the battlefield, but they just had to be there for what they knew would be the last time. And then the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, came, and he dedicated the Eternal Peace Memorial on that field, which again spoke to the hopes of a world on the brink of now a Second World War, and also became a major symbol of national reconciliation.
In the research for my first book, I met and spent time with 5 men who remembered their grandfathers who fought in the 20th Maine at Gettysburg. And I think one of the fascinations for us about the Civil War and about Gettysburg is that it's not that far back. There are people who were alive in our parents' lifetime who were alive at Gettysburg. And that, I think, makes it much closer, even though it has a distance to us. And it's a situation where both sides were Americans. And that's somewhat unique in world history, at least on this scope, so that we're interested in that. It's uniquely ours. You know, we didn't fight against another nation, and we didn't have allies fighting on one side or the other. This is strictly a family fight, and it sets us apart. And Gettysburg, as the biggest and largest and most significant battle, is the sort of symbolism of that. And you have, for example, 2 different regiments from Maryland, 1 Union and 1 Confederate, fighting in the same area. And you had, you know, the typical brother against brother. But all of that sort of came together here on this field, again, because of the scope. There were so many units and so many soldiers that it is a story, a larger story, just full of a lot of smaller stories that make up what all the things that we think of as Gettysburg.
It was such a magnitude of tragedy that it's we don't really get our arms around it. And so I think of all the conflicts and of all the events in American history, the highs and the lows, the Civil War stands out still, even with the advance of time, even with the greater distance we get from it. Look, I've been working on my Civil War movies for more than 20 years. More than 25 years, actually. So a big chunk of my life has been involved in researching these stories, telling these stories. And when I look around, I see a greater interest now than even when I started in the early late 1970s. So I think it's because of the initial catastrophic nature of the war, the fact that it was us and us. The fact also that it was fought in our own backyards. It wasn't fought in some faraway country, some faraway place, where only the soldiers went and some returned and some didn't. This was fought here. I live in Rappahannock County, Virginia. You look in any direction, you'll find a crossroads where this army moved north or this army moved south. Not far in adjoining counties, major battles of the Civil War were fought. There's a couple of houses right down the street from where I live that were used as hospitals by both armies moving south, moving north. Mosby's Raiders moved through here. So there's almost nowhere you can go which wasn't touched by the war. Also, I think the reasons why the war was fought still resonate. The issue of race is still very much in our consciousness as a people. We're still trying to work this out, still trying to strive to that perfection that Martin Luther King articulated, being able to look at one another, regardless of our racial and ethnic background, to be able to look at one another and see the content of our character and look beyond the superficie of what we see when we meet people, to find our common humanity. It's a different place here, certainly, than it was in the 1860s or even the 1960s when I grew up. But that striving for perfection, that's a road we're on, and so Americans are kind of acutely aware of this and sensitive to these issues. And that's something that the Civil War, the cauldron of the Civil War, encompasses in the issue of slavery and the abolition of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation. Another thing that was another issue of the war was, where does sovereignty lie? Does the principal sovereignty lie in the individual? Does it lie in the community? Does it lie within a state? Does it lie in the national governance? These were issues that were argued by the founding generation. If you read all the arguments that were conducted in the Constitutional Convention, should we have a unitary presidency? Should there be 3 people making up the presidency? The founding generation was concerned about the devolution of power. They didn't want to see a king. We fought a revolution to get rid of king and hereditary aristocracy. They were looking for a more democratic way to share power. They feared concentrated power. So these were embodied in the Constitution, the protections against concentrated power, the checks and balances. There were also the further protections in the Bill of Rights. And so when you had these various issues moving through the 1840s, 1850s, could they have been resolved amicably, peaceably? Probably yes. I mean, all history has crossroads and diverging points when you could have taken this path or taken that path. And the circumstances and the players in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s led to war. I don't think it was inevitable, but it led to war. And the consequences were dire. But so one of the issues that is articulated, certainly in the war starts, was the issue of, where does power lie? And those who made up the Confederate states that seceded would have argued in what we now call, and they call too, states' rights, that the political power was within the state governments, and that the state governments voluntarily came together to form a union, and that they could voluntarily leave. This was the argument for secession. And then the Unionists believed that, more or less, that the ultimate power resided in a federal government and that states could no longer voluntarily leave. That was I'm oversimplifying, but it's the original conflict that was, and the spark was Fort Sumter. And those issues are still with us. We still argue every day about whether we resolve a certain issue at the federal level or whether it should be left to the states, or even whether it should be left within the state to the communities. And we're constantly having these arguments about zoning, about private property, about roads, about who pays for things. Every single issue, it goes back to the same issues that were fought over the Civil War. So I think for all these reasons, for historic reasons, for political reasons, for cultural reasons, the Civil War seems to be the cauldron where all these issues are concentrated. And then finally, from a filmmaker's point of view and from a storyteller's point of view, when you look at the Civil War, you find these incredible characters, these incredible people. Whether they were wearing blue, whether they were wearing gray, whether they were civilians, whether they were black, whether they were white. They're human, but at the same time, they're almost larger than life. And so many of these people on their own become worthy subjects for novels, history, and for movies. So I have no doubt that, that for many generations to come, as long as there's an America, filmmakers will be making movies about the American Civil War.